The big day had finally arrived. The white dress, the church decorated with flowers, the nervousness of everyone. She felt like a princess about to be united with her prince. But when she looked at the altar, what should have been the happiest moment of her life turned into a nightmare. He wasn't there. Those seconds of silence, which felt like an eternity, were broken by the murmurs of the guests. The priest, confused, looked around, waiting for him to appear. But he didn't. Isabella's heart sank. She froze, unable to believe what was happening. But it wasn't just the groom who had disappeared. A feeling of abandonment, of despair, took over her body. She was alone at the altar, in front of everyone. That's when in the back someone approached. He was there, unexpectedly. Daniel, the childhood friend, always present but never enough to be seen as something more. He looked at her with tenderness, his face filled with concern. "Isabella, I'm here," he said, not really knowing how to console a woman in such a cruel moment. Without thinking, she ran to him. The tight hug he gave her was all she needed. A breath, a protection. But Daniel knew it wasn't his obligation. He had always seen her as a friend, yet in that moment he knew what his presence meant. He held her while she sobbed, her heart beating faster, not fully understanding what was happening. Love was there, but neither of them knew it yet. Daniel didn't know how to help her. All he could do was hold her tight and whisper comforting words. But inside, his heart was racing. He had always been there for Isabella, since they were children, through every laugh and tear. Yet, he never allowed himself to imagine being anything more to her. She was his best friend, his confidant, someone he'd always protect. Isabella slowly calmed down in his arms, wiping her eyes, still trembling. She looked up at him with a sad smile, trying to gather herself. "I don't know what happened, Daniel. He promised he'd be here." Daniel nodded, not knowing what to say. It hurt him to see her so vulnerable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He didn't know if it was the way she leaned into him, or the way his heart pounded in his chest. Maybe he wasn't the one," Daniel said softly, unsure of how his words would land. She gazed at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I thought he was, but now I don't know anything anymore." For a moment there was silence. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. Daniel wanted to say more, but he couldn't. He wanted to tell her that she deserved more than someone who could leave her standing alone. He wanted to say that maybe it was time for them to consider what had always been right in front of them. But Isabella wasn't ready for that conversation, and Daniel wasn't sure he was either. Days passed, and Isabella stayed with Daniel. She couldn't bear to return to the life she had planned with the man who had left her. Instead, she sought solace in the one person who had always been there for her, her friend. But as they spent more time together, things began to change. It wasn't just the comfort he provided or the familiar way he made her laugh. It was something else, something she couldn't put into words. When he looked at her, she felt a warmth that had never been there before. One evening after dinner, they were sitting on the couch, watching an old movie. She leaned against him, not thinking much of it. But as her head rested on his shoulder, she noticed how his body tensed slightly. A spark of something unfamiliar flickered between them. "Daniel," she whispered, almost as if testing the waters. "Why do you always take care of me like this?" He paused, unsure of how to answer. "Because you're my best friend," he replied, his voice sounding more distant than he intended. But she could hear the hesitation in his voice. She could feel it in the way he gently pulled her a little closer. It was as if he was trying to make sense of the emotions he hadn't let himself feel before. For the first time, Isabella wondered if Daniel was seeing her the way she had begun to see him. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel and Isabella found themselves in a routine that was both comforting and unnerving. They spent most of their time together, often reminiscing about the past, but there was an underlying tension that neither of them could ignore. One evening, they took a walk through the park, the autumn air crisp against their skin. The trees, now shedding their leaves, painted the path in shades of orange and gold. Isabella pulled her jacket tighter, enjoying the quiet of the evening. She had been feeling conflicted, unsure of what was happening between them. Daniel, walking beside her, couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. It wasn't just the heartbreak she'd endured, it was something deeper. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, but also a new kind of strength. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from any more pain, but he also wanted something more. He had been hiding it for weeks, burying his feelings under the guise of friendship, but now it was becoming impossible to ignore. "I've been thinking about everything," Isabella said, breaking the silence. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "About him, about us." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but he knew it was coming. "And what are you thinking?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I think I was so focused on what I thought I wanted, I never saw what was right in front of me." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes soft but full of meaning. "You, Daniel, you've always been here for me, and I never saw it, but now I can't ignore it anymore." Daniel's heart raced. He was scared to hope, to believe that this moment might be real. "Isabella!" His voice trailed off as she stepped closer to him. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. The simple touch sent a shockwave through both of them. "I don't know what this is, or where it will lead, but I think it's worth exploring," she said quietly. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in his life, he didn't have the words to explain how he was feeling. He had always been the strong one, the protector, but now he felt vulnerable, exposed in a way he had never experienced. Without a word, he took her hand in his, holding it tightly as if it was the most important thing in the world. And for him, in that moment, it was. The days following that conversation were a whirlwind of emotions. Isabella and Daniel had crossed a line, one that neither of them could ignore. It was no longer just about being friends. They had crossed into something deeper, something both beautiful and terrifying. Isabella found herself caught between the past and the present, torn between the memory of the man who had left her and the growing affection for the man who had always been by her side. It was hard to admit, even to herself, that the person she had once seen as a brother, a protector, was now someone she couldn't imagine her life without. One evening, as they sat in his living room, the air was thick with the unspoken tension between them. The soft hum of the television was the only sound, but neither of them was paying attention to it. Daniel was sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on the floor, wrestling with the same feelings that had been plaguing him for weeks. Isabella shifted in her seat, stealing a glance at him. She had wanted to talk about it, but she was scared. She was afraid that saying the wrong thing might ruin everything. But the silence was unbearable. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to know, where do we go from here?" He looked up at her, his eyes intense with emotion. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "I've never been in this situation before. I've always been there for you, but this is different. I can't just pretend that I'm not falling for you." Her heart skipped a beat. She had known it, had felt it, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. It was as if everything had shifted in that moment. The fear, the uncertainty, it all melted away. "I'm falling for you too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared, Daniel, scared that I'm rushing into something too soon. But I can't keep pretending that this isn't what I want." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and beautiful. They were both terrified, but they also knew that this was the moment of truth. This was the moment that would define everything. Daniel stood up, closing the distance between them. His heart was pounding, and he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But there was no turning back now. He reached for her, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and he leaned down to kiss her. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if both of them were waiting for the other to pull away. But neither of them did. The kiss deepened, and in that moment, everything they had been holding back was released. The past, the confusion, the fear, it all faded into the background. All that mattered was the person standing in front of them, the person who had always been there, the person they were finally allowing themselves to love. The days following their kiss felt like a new chapter, one neither of them had anticipated but both secretly desired. They had crossed the threshold into something that felt both fragile and powerful. Their friendship had transformed into something more, and every moment spent together was a discovery of how much deeper their connection could grow. But with their new relationship came new challenges. The uncertainty still lingered, as both Isabella and Daniel questioned whether they were moving too fast. Their pasts were complicated, Isabella with the scars of her failed engagement, and Daniel with his own hesitations about crossing that line with her. But even with the doubts that crept in, they couldn't deny the undeniable chemistry between them. Every glance, every touch, every conversation felt electric, as if they were finally acknowledging something that had been there all along. One evening, they took a walk through the city. The lights of the street lamps bathed the path in a soft glow, and the air was crisp with the hint of the coming winter. They didn't say much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a peaceful quiet, one that allowed them to simply be present with each other. Isabella walked a few steps ahead, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. Daniel noticed how her hair fluttered in the breeze, how her smile seemed to light up the world around her. He had always admired her from afar, but now that they were together, he couldn't help but wonder how he ever managed to live without her by his side. "Daniel, do you ever wonder if we're making the right choice?" Isabella asked suddenly, breaking the silence. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression thoughtful, a little uncertain. "I mean, we're both just starting to figure this out. What if we're rushing into something that isn't real?" Daniel smiled softly, walking over to her and gently taking her hand. "I don't know if there's ever a perfect time for something like this," he said. "But I know one thing for sure. We can't deny what we feel, and I think that's enough." Isabella's heart fluttered at his words. She had been afraid of losing herself, of moving too quickly. But standing there, with Daniel by her side, she realized that love didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. "I think you're right," she said, her voice soft. "Maybe we're not perfect, but we're real. And I think that's all we need." They stood there for a moment, simply looking at each other, letting the quiet of the night surround them. It was as if the world had faded away, leaving just the two of them in their own bubble of understanding. Then, without another word, Daniel pulled her into his arms. The warmth of his embrace was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had been searching for. She closed her eyes, letting herself feel the comfort of his presence, knowing that no matter where life took them, they would face it together. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel and Isabella's relationship grew stronger. They had found a rhythm, a sense of peace in their new dynamic. But even in the calm, there was an undercurrent of unease. For Isabella, it was the lingering shadow of her past. She had never fully healed from the heartbreak of her abandoned wedding, and she often found herself haunted by memories of the man who had once promised her forever. One afternoon, as they sat in a cafe, Daniel noticed that something was off. Isabella was quieter than usual, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. He could see the conflict in her face, the way her fingers absently traced the rim of her coffee cup. It wasn't the first time he had seen her like this, but today, it felt different. "Isabella, what's wrong?" Daniel asked gently, his voice filled with concern. She looked up at him, her eyes betraying the emotions she had been keeping hidden. "I don't know how to move on from him," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I start to feel like I'm healing, I'm reminded of how I was left. It's like a wound that never really closed." Daniel's heart ached for her. He knew how much the abandonment had hurt her, but he also knew that it wasn't something she could just forget. It would take time and patience. "I know it's hard," Daniel said softly, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "But you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Isabella's eyes welled with tears, and she quickly blinked them away, ashamed of the vulnerability she had just shown. "I'm scared, Daniel. Scared that I'll never truly be able to let go of what happened, that I'll always be carrying this with me." Daniel squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her. "You will let go in your own time, and I'll be here every step of the way. You don't have to do it alone." She smiled, a small but genuine smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't deserve this kind of love, this kind of understanding, but here he was, offering it to her without hesitation. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. "I don't know what I would do without you," she admitted, her voice full of emotion. "You'll never have to find out," Daniel said, his words firm and full of conviction. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, Isabella realized something profound. She had been living in the shadows of her past, unable to move forward, because she had never fully embraced the love that was standing right in front of her. With Daniel, she could heal. With him, she could face her fears. She wasn't alone anymore. It was a quiet evening, the city streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights as Isabella and Daniel walked hand in hand through the park. The air was cool, carrying the promise of a new season. Their breaths were visible in the night as they walked together without speaking, letting the world around them fade away. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had come a long way since that day at the altar. The pain of being abandoned had not disappeared overnight, but it was no longer the only thing she saw when she looked at herself. With Daniel by her side, she had begun to understand that her worth wasn't tied to the promises of someone else. She was whole on her own, and Daniel was the one who reminded her of that every single day. As they reached a bench in the park, they sat down together, the stillness of the night surrounding them. Isabella leaned against Daniel, her head resting on his shoulder. He had always been her protector, her rock, but now he was more than that. He was the love she had never thought she deserved, the warmth she had been missing. "I've been thinking," Isabella said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "About what?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle, curious. "About the future, about us," she said, lifting her head to look at him. "I'm not sure what comes next, but I know that I want to keep moving forward. I want to see where this goes, with you." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always known that he wanted to be with her, but hearing her say it, hearing her admit that she wanted the same, made everything feel so much more real. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Daniel said, his voice filled with conviction. "We've been through so much together, and I know we can handle whatever comes next. I want to build a future with you, Isabella, whatever that looks like." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined that love could feel so steady, so comforting, and yet so exciting at the same time. Daniel had been there for her in ways no one else ever had. He had loved her when she couldn't love herself, and now she was ready to give him the same in return. "I don't know what's ahead, but I do know one thing," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I want to face it with you." Daniel took her hand in his, their fingers entwining naturally, as if they had always belonged together. He looked into her eyes, seeing the woman who had once been lost, but who had now found herself in his love. "I'm with you, Isabella," he said softly. "Always." And in that moment, under the starry sky, everything felt right. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Isabella could see a future, one full of hope, of healing, and of love that would only grow stronger with time.